Hi there. So today in this lesson, I want to talk to you about fine art and craft. And there's often a distinction made when talking about ceramics that we're working with craft as opposed to fine art. And so I want to give you a little kind of a broad view of the history of where that distinction comes from, how it is or isn't relevant to us today. But the other thing I'm going to sneak in here is I want to give you lots of pictures. So there's going to be, particularly towards the end of the interactive lesson, there's going to be lots of pictures of artists, and I'm hoping to get you inspired. So I've got really different images here that we'll see names for these folks when we get farther along. But you can see that there's sculptural work, more functional work, and a lot of work that's kind of in between somewhere. So when we talk about craft, fine art, and contemporary ceramics, we sometimes make the assumption, like I said, that ceramics is craft. It's made for function. The point of it is to store food or to eat out of or to, have in your kitchen. Now, I say this with the understanding that a lot of us, the work we make in a ceramics class might actually end up sitting on a shelf unused. And so the funny thing is we have these multiple histories of how ceramics is viewed and understood to be the point of it, right? And it often has, ceramics often has been used for functional reasons, for functional purposes, for reasons we understand, right? It holds water, it's easy to clean, you can use it over and over again, you can put it in the oven, you can put it in the microwave. But we run into a complication now in contemporary society is a lot of us have mass-produced objects that we eat and drink out of more often than handmade work. And so we sometimes even make a further distinction. This is mass-produced ceramics, this is sort of fine art ceramics, and this is art alone. And so I want to talk about these lines, and really my point is that there's not a really strong distinction. The pieces that we're looking at here all were originally made to be used. Obviously, the use of the flower pots as a sculpture here is a little different than anticipated, but something like this or something like this might end up sitting on a shelf in someone's kitchen or dining room and not being used today. Whereas certainly its history was that it was originally designed and meant to be used. Now, today, we might make a really strong distinction, and here I've got some examples that fit a little bit better, right? We have the kind of handmade student pottery. We have the ceramics that's made in a mold, the slip cast ceramics that you can go to a place and paint it. Everybody gets the same one, and what you're doing is making the colors your own. Or the kind of work that is made for function primarily, and your work is going to be the pieces that you get are going to be really similar to everybody else's. There's often been a distinction between that being craft, and I'm doing air quotes, right? Quote unquote craft, stuff you make either for fun or simply for function. And we think of it as kind of like low and cheap and for entertainment or function more than for fine art, fancy kind of things. And so over here on the right, I have some paintings, right? I didn't grab any sculptures, but painting and sculpture you might see in a museum. And we think of this as very, very different. And ceramics sometimes runs into this issue, right? That we're in an art program here at YVC, but there's sometimes a distinction made between the stuff that's made for a hobby and the stuff that's made for real art, right? And I want to break up that distinction a little bit. And to do that, I'm gonna sneak us way back in history for a moment, because I think it's important to understand when this distinction shows up, because it doesn't show up right away. When people first are using ceramics, there's no difference between, there's no idea of fine art. There's not this, there aren't museums. You don't have the sense of go put this in a museum. Of course, this stuff, these ancient artworks, are in museums now, but they weren't. They were made for, we think, probably function. We're not totally sure about the Venus, quote unquote Venus, the woman from Dolní Věstonice. That is a figure that is prehistoric, and so we don't have any written history. We don't know why it was used. We have some guesses that it might have been traded among different groups of people. They didn't all live in cities at the time, and so they traveled, and they may have traded these small figures. They may have also, see the crack on it, they may have also put them into the fire as some sort of ceremony, and cracked it during the firing. This particular, these figures that are now called Venuses, the Venus is really an inappropriate term because Venus didn't exist yet. But there's some idea that they may have been related to fertility, ideas of fertility, because of the big breasts and the big hips and stuff like that. And ultimately, we don't know. Now, we do know about the deity, right? This household deity from Serbia. This would have been a god in a house, and so it would have been part of a ritual worship or maybe offerings made to a deity. And though all of those kinds of uses, whether it's for ceremonies or religious purpose or trade and community building and stuff like that, all of those are functional uses that really aren't separated from how they look, right? They're made to be looked at and used, both together, no distinction. Now, we of course also know about pottery being used for pottery, for functional sorts of uses. So here we have again, these are both Jomon pottery, earlier and a little bit later time periods. And of course the Jomon pottery is really beautiful, decorative and stuff, but this was put into the ground and it was cooked in. We have evidence of this because even though the Jomon folks didn't write down what they were doing, we do have essentially bits of food that we can find traces of. Archaeologists can find traces of the food inside the pottery here, and so they can tell how it was used. Similar with this kind of thing. Now, this one is less decorative, but it's also somewhat damaged. One of the troubles is we always look at old work and it's been damaged. And so what we're missing here is that there's, some of the bits and pieces here are have been damaged over time. But Jomon pottery, the name actually comes from rolling this rope texture or impressing this rope texture into the pottery. And so again, it was made for function, it was made for use. There was no kind of separating of like the high and the low. We're going to look at some other examples of more contemporary functional and non-functional uses where we kind of mix these things. But in the next slide, in the next page, I want to talk to you a little bit about techniques used for making this stuff. Because one of the things we sometimes make the assumption about is that when the work is mass produced, like these are mass produced on a small scale, but an individual artist didn't make each flower. They made one and then they made a mold of it, and then the people decorating it are working from the same mold. That idea of mass production, we think of that as being kind of new, and we think that lowers the value in some ways. But I want to show you some examples of why that's not quite right.